Show me the video. I'm very glad to have you back to this podcast, and we're going to talk about the general economic situation in the Middle East, in Levant, during different Muslim dynasties and different Muslim states. So you can start with some kind of retrospect.
Well, I think it's very important to recognize that the growing Islamic world from the 7th century onward means that despite the political unity of the Umayyads and the early Abbasids, one state, one ummah sort of thing, it becomes so large that we are really beginning to deal with multiple Islamic worlds in terms of economic activities. And so I'm glad you specified the term the Levant, because the Eastern Mediterranean, Egypt, and Bilad al-Sham is obviously linked to all these other regions through trade routes, and all this is very well known and attested to. It also has its own unique challenges and geographical realities. And we tend to look at Egypt and Syria and Bilad al-Sham, greater Bilad al-Sham, as kind of a unit, because it often was politically during the Middle Islamic period, by the time we moved from the Fatimids into the Ayyubids and the Mamluks. But even then, we have these differences about Egypt so centrally dependent on the Nile Valley, and yet a very different sort of agricultural basis in Bilad al-Sham. So I think we're well past the days of easy acceptance of old hypotheses, such as the parenthesis, which argued that the Islamic conquest of the southern and eastern Mediterranean eliminated trade. We know that's not the case. The evidence base that has come to light makes that pretty clear. It's just that trade patterns had shifted, right? And so one of the things that's I think really important to note about the geophysical reality is that in Egypt, you have primarily Cairo, or the many cities that are now called as such a major entrepot and marketplace, and of course its main port city of Alexandria. Whereas in Egypt, you have Damascus, which has been and certainly was in this period a major center of economic activities, but also linked to its surrounding cities, such as Halab or Hama or Tripoli, for example. And so we see perhaps a more varied economic stage, if you will, in the Syrian provinces of the Fatimids, as small as they were, into the Ayyubid period, much greater, and then of course the Mamluk period as well. One of the things I think is really makes it such a fascinating area to study is source material, which of course we're dependent on survival and what's been found and then subsequently read. And we are lucky in that over the last 40, 50 years, in the growth of interest and the recognition of the importance of the so-called Islamic Middle Period from the 1500, that more and more scholars around the world are working on it, and we have these sets of sources that are episodic in their availability. In Egypt, for example, we have surviving documentary evidence, papyrus and things like that from early on into the Fatimid and Ayyubid period. Similarly, we have material in the literary material and some documentary material that's coming to light in the Eastern Mediterranean Levantine coast region. So I think we've learned a lot more over the last few years, but I don't know if it's gotten to the point where we have a sort of a comprehensive overview yet. We know a lot more, and what we've learned, I think, is really sort of, at least for me, it's really informed the fact that there's more we need to know.
Yeah.
For example, the coming to light of the Haram al-Sharif documents, the archive of a Shafite Qadi in Jerusalem from the basically from the 14th century that came to light about 40 years ago. While important, especially for social history, contained numerous wills, attestations, other sorts of court-like cases that shed light on economic processes, and people like Kamal Asali and others have explored these documents, published them, brought them to light. And we know, for example, one of my favorite anecdotes from the Haram al-Sharif documents is I guess you would call it not a will, but a statement of what's left behind when a woman died.
So it's some kind of a testament, maybe, or
yes, that's as good a word as any.
Yeah, testament.
My retrieval of technical terminology is perhaps needs more coffee. And this particular testament recalls that among her goods left after her death was a scale, presumably a double pan scale, where you hold and a pan here and a pan here, and you establish weight that way. And then a number of, I think two, possibly one or two more Roman coins, which were, we don't know what kind of Roman coins there were. It just said 2 coin, Rumani. And presumably this was her scale and her weights by which she could weigh goods and services. And that's just one of many little anecdotes that actually indicate that one of the things we realize about this Middle Islamic period in Bilad Asham is that the coinage was also could be in some cases very irregular in weight. Not always. Certainly there are exceptions to what I said, but at certain times, particularly in the later Ayyubid and the Mamluk period, the coins that you would encounter in daily life, or so we say elevated daily life, elevated social silver coins, are remarkably varied, and which meant most likely that they couldn't pass, by count. 1, 2, 3, 4. They had to be weighed. And there's so many different ways you can build off of this, but I think another parallel in historical tendencies has been increasing emphasis on, can we move beyond the court? Can we move beyond the imperial center?
Yeah.
And of course, that's where most of our written records come from. Whether it's in the Fatimid period with all the documents that survive, all the historical chronicles that survive, or even in the Mamluk period, where we have clearly a literary history tradition in Cairo and a slightly different emphasis in Damascus. What about the bulk of the population that lives outside of those regions? And I think that's where the work of our colleague Bethany Walker, for example, she's not alone, in exploring rural archaeology in the Eastern Mediterranean Levantine region has been so important, right? But archaeological digs in Jordan, for example, have revealed evidence of everyday life and hints about how the economy functioned. And that is something that people writing 40, 50 years ago did not have.
What do you think about the notion that Fatimid rule was more economically liberal than Ayyubid and Mamluk periods?
You know, I I would question that.
Yeah,
And primarily because not only do we have this issue of sort of court-based perspectives that tended to celebrate and praise the actions of the Fatimid government, the caliph, and in some cases viziers. But we also know that the Fatimids engendered a lot of criticism from those outside of their realms. And I think this is a tricky thing to talk about, but you never want to base an entire argument on the absence of evidence, right? Because lots of things could get in the way of whether something survives or not. But the Fatimids are thought by some today to have introduced glass coinage. And this relates to a bigger issue that, for much of the early Islamic period and the much of the early part of the Islamic middle period, 1000 to 1500, the primary coins you encounter are silver and gold. And of course, those were very valuable precious metals, and their availability to everyday folk was probably limited. But then one of the aspects of money, of coinage, is to ease transactions, right? To have a way of establishing some sort of equivalent value between sheep and wheat, to give two examples. And there was evidently and I think this is the case, the evidence certainly supports it, a tremendous need for small change in the Fatimid period. We suspect this from, one, Fatimid silver coins are relatively rare today, but that may be because people weren't interested in them as collectors in the modern period because they were low quality, little pieces of low alloy silver, often called black. Sometimes they're called black dirham, dirham aswad. Sometimes they're called paper dirhams, dirham warak. It doesn't mean that they're made out of paper. It just means that they were small, thin, and we know extremely low quality silver, less than a third. And that's the name black, because low quality silver tarnishes and gets darker quicker. But then there are hundreds, if not thousands, of surviving little glass discs from the Fatimid period. Some bear the names of the Fatimid caliphs, and some bear the names of the workshops that produced them. And so what was the use of these things? They're found primarily in Egypt, but in archaeological sites in Jordan, they've been found in and around Aqaba, for example. Mm-hmm. They clearly had some sort of metrological use, in the sense that their weights were very consistent, around 3 grams and around 6 grams, and even around 1.5 grams. So there are basically two views of these things. One was that they were produced to weigh coins, because we know that the coins were of irregular weight. You had a basic sort of seal of approval from the Department of Weights and Measures. This was, 1 dirham's worth of silver weight. Other people have argued that they became coinage. They became sort of a token coinage, a jeton, if you will.
Yeah,
that debate has been going on for several decades. For me, it seems unlikely that they would have been small change. Holding glass objects in a little leather purse, glass breaks, and we have broken things, right? And so I'm not, in today I would think about jiggling change in my pocket, but if you're doing that with gold, with glass, it could break. And moreover, there is nothing in the Islamic corpus of Islamic law and economic treatises that would support the use of glass as a medium of exchange. That's a coin. I mean, and I would have, I'm tempted to speculate that if they had done that officially, their critics from outside would have seized upon that. Remember, contemporary non-Fatimid historians called them Ubaidis, not Fatimids, and they were quick to criticize anything they did. So, we have two issues there. One, what was the purpose of these glass discs? But moreover, they do seem to, what did everyday folk use in their economic transactions? When copper coins begin to be much more common in the Ayyubid and Fatimid period, that seems to solve one of those issues. But there's a passage in Makrizi, the famous Mamluk historian who died in the 1440s, frequent critic of the Mamluk regime, who said that when he was growing up in Alexandria in the 1370s, people would use bread as a form of exchange. So bartering with goods. So we have this great issue. We know that money was used at some levels of society. There's evidence that at particularly lower levels of society, the suggestion is that money may have been used, but also other
goods were involved.
Yeah.
What do you think about the concept of centralization of economic system in Mamluk or Ayyubid periods?
Yeah.
Did they have a centralized system? That's important.
Yeah, we have a centralized bureaucratic system that is dedicated to registering and tracking the land, right? One of the achievements of the Ayyubids and Saladin is often stated as their spread of the Iqta system across the region of Egypt and Eastern Mediterranean region. And then, of course, an Iqta was the grant to the use of land that was then payment for military and governmental officials. So you weren't given the land. It wasn't a fief in that sense, but you were given the right to the product of the land. And so we see in the Ayyubid period and in the Mamluk period, this occasional large effort by the central government to go out and verify the land, right? This must have been a huge bureaucratic undertaking involving hundreds of people, most likely, but by reviewing the land. Okay, how much land is under cultivation? Who does it belong to in terms of who are the residents? What tax rate have they paid historically, et cetera? And these cadastral surveys are called rauks in Arabic. And we have some of them that survive. So in Egypt, for example, we have this magisterial surviving rauk we don't have the actual route, but we have a great deal of information about how land was distributed in the Fayoum, right, which has been exploited quite well recently to teach us a lot more about the relations between settled societies and Bedouin societies in that region. And in the Mamluk period, of course, we have two major ones, the second one of which takes place in the reign of Sultan Nasser Muhammad, which has wide-ranging repercussions because it involves the redistribution of the rights to these lands. And Nasser Muhammad uses it to reward some of his followers, take away these Iqta grants from others perceived as rivals, etc. And so through references to those rauks in other works, we don't actually have the surviving documentation. I don't think it's been found yet of the actual bureaucratic effort itself. we can learn about, what crops were being grown in this particular region. This also applies to the Syrian regions. What crops, what was the cycle, what were the tax rates, if there were Ahl Dhimma, people of the book, protected people living in these villages, what were their tax rates, what jizya was in place, stuff like this. And the tantalizing bits that survive, make us hunger for more. But it does get, it is possible to learn a bit more. And of course, the work keeps going. So again, Bethany Walker, for example, in her work in Jordan, has not only coupled the material culture and excavation evidence from her surveys and digs, but also with going into the early Ottoman period to see the records that survive there about the same bits of information. Taxation may be horrible for those paying it, depending on your political views, right? But the
but you have to pay taxes, of course.
Yeah, well, it's like life, right? Like death,
of
right?
course.
It's inevitable. But they're the act of recording taxes and figuring out tax rates is historians' gold. You can learn an awful lot from a certain perspective about what's going on in the landscape.
I wanted to ask you something about whether Ayyubids opened up the Mediterranean trades to European merchants during their reign. We're talking about 12th and 13th centuries.
That's an interesting question. I think we could look even a little earlier than that. One of the remarkable sets of surviving evidence from the late Fatimid, Ayyubid into early Mamluk period is the so-called Geniza document collection. Mm-hmm. This was a vast hoard of paper and papyrus that was found in the Geniza, a storeroom of a synagogue in Old Cairo. The synagogue Geniza was distributed in the late 19th century, and these materials are now found around the world. But what basically happened was that the Jewish community of Cairo, which was linked around the Mediterranean into Syria and certainly into the Indian Ocean, the traders and merchants involved in that community deposited many of their records there. And so this is really interesting material. A lot of it's written in Judeo-Arabic, Arabic written in Hebrew characters, and people have been working on it for over a century now. And we see this incredible network amongst the Jewish trader community of Cairo, linking the Eastern Mediterranean to the Western, to the Northern, to Spain, whatever, and then even into Central Asia and the Indian Ocean basin. And so we know this trade is going on. At the same time, by the Mamluk period, we get increasing reference to the presence of European traders, merchants in the Mamluk Sultanate, in the coastal cities, and even the capital of Cairo and Damascus, from what we now call Spain, from the Italian city-states, etc. And so, how did that happen? That's a really good question, and I can't answer it right now, but by the late 14th century, for example, and even the late even to say in the 14th century, for example, we begin to hear and encounter more and more accounts of Italian gold coinage in circulation in the Mamluk domains, both the Egyptian and Syrian provinces. And from the Geniza documents from the Fatimid period and into the Ayyubid period, we have references to purses of coins, sealed purses of coins, meaning that an amount of gold or silver would be put in like a leather pouch and then sealed at a set amount. Like this will be 30 dinars worth of gold, this sort of thing. And when opened, it could contain coins from across the Mediterranean basin. So while we may be lacking official proof of some of these activities, we have evidence that suggests it's going on, right? And the Mamluks in the 15th century, early 15th century, the famous incident of Sultan Barzbai attempting to monopolize the spice trade into the Indian Ocean, displacing the so-called Khadrami merchants, the wealthy merchants of Cairo who had run this trade for a very long time. That's an example of central government inserting itself into this market. But I think we have to be aware that our written evidence base is skewed towards the cities and often towards the interests of the people who mattered, not just the rulers, but also the educated ulama class. And the gap between what's expected and what's right and what's actually done is often wide, right? And this is also true on the other side of the equation. We know that from the late Crusader period on, that various popes placed an interdiction on trade with the Muslim East. Why would, and yet we know that a city-state like Venice continued to trade. So at the end, for example, at the end of the 14th century, the Mamluk Sultanate began importing extremely large amounts of copper from Europe, because by that time there were no copper mines working in Egypt or in the Levant. Of course, there had been copper mines in the region of Jordan, very, very much earlier. And interestingly enough, recent work has indicated that there were attempts to perhaps reopen them in what's probably the Ayyubid period, as demand for copper increased, but they don't seem to have amounted to much. So anyway, the Mamluk Sultanate is importing large amounts of copper in the 790s, the 1380s and 90s, and the stated purpose for this is they're issuing large amounts of very large copper coinage. And this coinage is described in the Mamluk sources as the fulus al-judud, the new, literally it's just a basic term, the new fulus. It's just generic. Anytime a new coin comes out, it's the new one, right? But this particular set of coinage in the second half of the 14th century, that generic label, new fulus, gets applied. Okay. Yeah.
Now we can continue with coins from late 14th century, before the invasion launched by Tamerlane, that we mentioned him before in our previous conversation, that he was some kind of a menace to the region. He affected not only Levant, he affected Central Asia, India, Asia Minor with his conquest. But we discussed the problem of coins and problem of copper coins in the late 14th century.
Yeah, I was just going to continue with that.
Yeah, continue,
to the extent
please.
that in the 1430s and the 1440s, well after those coins were introduced, the historian El-Makrizi still refers to them as the new fulus. So clearly something was going on that even though that generic term actually seemed to become an actual name referring to a certain type of coinage. And this I think ties into the fact that copper coinage, being low value, is seen as small change, and there seems to always be a need for small change. Sometimes that's answered by low quality silver coins or smaller silver coins. Sometimes it's addressed by slivers of gold coins, little fractions of gold coins, as was done during the Crusader period. Although a fraction of a gold coin is still going to be worth a whole lot more than a 6 gram or 4 gram copper coin. And what makes this so challenging for us trying to understand the economic life and its repercussions into daily life is that unlike other parts of the world in this time period, we don't have yet much like administrative materials or manuals, right? So what references we do have are to the coins themselves and to references to the coins in the histories written by the Mamluk era authors, and then of course by what archaeologists are discovering today. There is a mint manual from the Ayyubid period by a man named Ibn Ba'ra, which gives us a lot of information about how coins were minted. But even a later Mamluk historian with the wonderful name Ibn Sayrafi, son of the money changer, doesn't give us a great deal of influence about how money changers actually worked. So, and why this is of interest or whatever, I mean, that's for individual people to make on their own. But we know that there were multiple coins from multiple eras and from multiple locations in circulation in cities like Cairo or Damascus or Jerusalem, et cetera, et cetera. And determining the relative value of those coins was, of course, the Sayrafi's job, and as well as to make a profit from it.
What do you think about the Mediterranean trade in late medieval period? We mentioned Jewish communities in Eastern Mediterranean, in Western Mediterranean. We know that Salonika was a well-known trade center and well-known center of so-called Oriental Jews, because they differ, of course, from Ashkenazims, who are another category. They had their own trade. They were not involved in East Mediterranean trade. But what do you think about the notion that in that period, church discriminated the Jewish community, and to some extent, maybe they were pushed into different financial sectors or social sectors?
Yeah, I mean, that's
because the church in Europe in general had a very discriminatory policies towards them, and they were always associated with we trade with lending money, and some of these stereotypes persist, unfortunately, till now.
Yeah, I mean, the issue of stereotypes is of course multifaceted and
Exactly.
always with us. I think that the by bringing up the Geniza, one, I'm a history nerd, and I just think that the Geniza is fascinating.
Yeah.
And I know my own work has benefited from reading these documents in translation, and the work of the many scholars who've been spending their lives working on this stuff. And of course, the Geniza documents writ large include evidence, include letters and contracts discussing trade, not just within these family networks of these Jewish families of the 12th to 14th century, but also their interactions with merchants otherwhere and other places. And I think the part of your question that really interests me is this part of, it's just abundantly clear that trade across the Mediterranean was extensive. It was local, it was regional, it was international. And the more we learn about it, the more we know that's the case. I mean, we're not just reinforcing, but the impact of these little bits of information taken into and integrated into a wider whole, not WHOLE, I think is just very interesting and fascinating and very valuable for us to know. There is other evidence above and beyond the Geniza. There is the evidence that comes in through the Mamluk Chronicles and from other chronicles of the Ayyubid and Fatimid period. There's also the archaeological evidence. When you find Spanish goods or Spanish coins or North African near Ak, right? That's, someone had to carry them there. There was a famous hoard of sigil Masan 11th century gold coins found near Aqaba about 30 years ago, and just buried near a site. And then it gets into these interesting ramifications, and the Mediterranean is literally littered with shipwrecks, and shipwrecks from the Roman and Greek period. We know a lot more about what their cargo was because they were shipping things in amphoras. And there's a wonderful book that was just published recently about that contains a chapter about shipwrecks in the later periods and moving into the Islamic period, where it's clear that the packing material has changed, right? Things are packed in cloth bags or even wooden vessels of some kind. Yeah, there's still amphora and clay things, but when those ships fall apart, those goods decay. The amphoras fell right to the bottom, right? And you could discover stuff from them. And so the shipwrecks, we do find are fascinating from this middle period. We often don't get as detailed a sense of what they were shipping as we do from the earlier period. And I just think that's an unintended consequence of long distance trade moving to lighter weight shipping vessels, and of course they weren't hoping to sink, and they certainly weren't thinking about us modern historians when they sank. But that's a repercussion.
You worked in Jordan for many years, probably decades. Mm-hmm. And since Jordan, or let's say modern Jordan, because back in the days, Jordan didn't exist as a state, and it was part of Greater Syria. what kind of evidence we have regarding the fiscal policies of greater centers like Damascus or Cairo? Do we have enough coins or enough material evidence that can point out to that direction and tell us more about the interconnectedness between Transjordanian area or Transjordanian heartland and great urban centers?
Yeah, I think there's a lot to be said there. We know, for example, that there was tremendous centralized supported investment in the Ruhr and the Jordan Valley, in the sugar industry in the first century of the Mamluk period. So there's government interest there. And we also know that the Mamluks in particular established administrative outposts. Tel Hispan was clearly one. Later, Amman became one, etc. They were Kerak in the south, where there was, relatively constant imperial contact with these regions. And of course, also the aspect of since many of the rural lands and villages had been caught up in that cadastral survey, they were generating income that would flow to the capitals, some to individuals, but increasingly through the use of awqaf documents to support religious institutions founded by leading emirs and sultans of the Mamluk state. Alternatively, to what degree did these economic policies impact the people there? Well, when the sugar industry was active, presumably it provided income for many people. It related to the various phases of sugar production and shipping. When that eventually falls a Black Death, that's probably a contributing factor to shifting population, perhaps increasing movement into pastoral nomadism, etc., which other scholars have talked about. But I think what's focusing on Jordan itself, it's such within the modern boundaries of Jordan. It's clearly part of the Mamluk Sultanate, and it's home to two major castles, which the Mamluks invested a great deal of money in: Schaulbeck, Montreal, and Kerak. And so we know that there is government interest there. Fawzi Ziyadin back in the 80s wrote an article about Sultan Baybars's trip across through the Nabatean regions to get to Kerak, and we know that Sultan Nasser Muhammad probably visited Petra because there's his inscription on the cenotaph of Aaron at the top of Jabal Harun. At the same time, during the Ayyubid period, when there was significant interest in this territory, with the exception of Gaza on the coast, there were no Ayyubid mints south of Damascus and north. That whole region was mintless, but yet we find lots of Ayyubid coins throughout Jordan, indicating that to some certain extent, the economy was monetized, whether it was through the paying of soldiers or civil servants or whatever. And that same situation, minus Gaza, there are no Mamluk mints anywhere within the boundaries of Jordan on either side of the Jordan River. And again, we find Mamluk coins everywhere, sometimes in huge amounts. Back in the 1960s, several thousand, 3,000+ silver dirhams were found in Kerak during a construction zone. And there were silver coins. It was an enormous amount of money. What it was to be used for, we would presume it was probably used for payment of the garrison whatnot. But, then the garrison
Yeah.
turns around and spends its money buying supplies and
Of course.
whatnot. So um, while the region may not have been in the forefront of the authors of historical chronicles at the time, it was certainly part of the Mamluk Sultanate, and through the taxes it paid, and through the varying levels of central investment in the region itself.
At the end, I'm going to ask you what are your plans for 2022, 2023? I've spoken with Bethany. She's not going to dig this year, but are you planning to visit us?
I would like to. But in the meantime, I have a lot of writing to do. Some of it's related to the projects I've undertaken for Bethany. I know she's waited very patiently for me to wrap up some of these things. Sometimes one just needs to get away from the pressures of everyday life for a time in order to devote time without interruption to some of these things. But quite frankly, I don't know if I'll be visiting Jordan in the near future. I would like to. I'm just fascinated by this issue of money being circulated in regions where there are no mints, especially the lower value coins. We've talked about this briefly before.
Yeah.
I don't want to sound like a one-trick pony, but there's just there's that great library at Acor where you can find published and unpublished archaeological reports, in which there is so much information yet to be gleaned about coinage in particular, but the repercussions of what the presence of those coins may suggest to us. That would be a place I would love to visit sooner rather than later.
I hope you're going to find time to join us here. It would be very nice to have you in Amman. Also, thank you for your time and lots of valuable information that you shared with us. And hopefully you're going to finish writing your books and scholarly papers.
Inshallah.
Thank you so much.
You're welcome. It's always great to chat with you. Thanks.
Thank you so much.